Morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us to discuss the issue paper and straw proposal for the 2021 Contract Management Enhancement Initiative. My name is Isabella Nicosia, representing ISO Stakeholder Affairs, and I'll be facilitating the web conference today. I'm also joined on the line by our presenters, Jason Foster, Lead Q Management Specialist for Infrastructure Contracts and Management, Deb Levine, Director of Infrastructure Contracts and Management, and Clyde Lutan, Principal of Renewable Energy Integration. The presentation, along with the issue paper and straw proposal, are available out on the initiative webpage. This call is being recorded. The recording is for informational and convenience purposes only, and any related transcription should not be reprinted without the ISO's permission. Before we get started, I have a couple housekeeping reminders. This meeting is structured to stimulate dialogue and engage different perspectives, and while we always welcome comments and feedback, just a reminder to please keep those professional and respectful, and then try to be brief and refrain from repeating what has already been said so that we can manage the time efficiently today and address as many comments and questions as possible. So we will be taking questions throughout the call today. There is a new process for raising your hand to ask a question. So if you connected to audio through your computer or had the WebEx call you, then you'll need to select the raise hand icon, which is located just above the chat window, located on the bottom right-hand corner of your screen. If you dialed into the conference and connected audio separately, then you'll need to press #2 to enter the question queue. If you need technical assistance at any point during the call today, you can send a chat to the event producer. Her name is Shreya. And then just a reminder to please remember to state your name and affiliation before making your comment or asking your question. You can also send your question through the chat to me. Again, my name is Isabella Nicosia, or you can send it to all panelists. But if you choose to go that route, please be sure to include your organization name when typing your question. So the agenda today, we're going to go over a brief welcome and introduction, and then we'll move into CAISO as an effective system study agreement. Then we have a few topics to cover related to retirements and repower, as well as modification adjustments. And then we'll share some details around the generator interconnection study process agreement effective date, and then give an update on market quality, specifically the deadband and droop requirement revisions to the GIA. And then we'll wrap up today's call with some next steps. And just to note here that the ISO is planning an IPE process for later this year. So this slide just shows where we are currently at in the policy initiative stakeholder process. So we are here in the proposal development section right at issue paper and straw proposal. So the proposed initiative schedule for COMA 2021. Right now, we will have comments due on the issue paper and straw proposal back on August 31, and we have details about that date at the end of the presentation. And then we have the dates for the revised straw proposal tentatively scheduled for September and October, with the stakeholder meeting at the beginning of October, and then putting out the draft final proposal in mid-November, and then taking comments back on that in mid-December, with a target Board of Governors date in February. But just something to note is that the schedule may be adjusted if a step in the process is no longer necessary. So if we decide that the revised straw proposal is not necessary, we could go straight into the draft final proposal, and the dates could change a little bit. So with that, I will hand it over to Jason Foster, and we will go ahead and get started with the CAISO as an effective system study agreement topic. So Jason, take it away.
All right, thank you, Isabella, for the introduction and hosting us today, much appreciated. Just to set the stage for questions and comments, there are a number of sections as you saw on the agenda. I will pause after each larger section, and we'll ask for questions and open for discussion following each section. So it might be one slide, and it could be a number of slides between questions. So, all right, go ahead, and we're kicking it off with the CAISO as an effective system study agreement proposal. So as we see more and more generation projects being proposed and developed, The CAISO is seeing the impact of interconnections on neighboring balancing authorities. It's important that the CAISO review these generation projects to ensure that there's no system impacts and that we can maintain reliability on our CAISO grid. So with that, the CAISO in the issue paper did propose a pro forma agreement to be utilized, as well as some additional language that would be proposed or added to Appendix DD to address this. One, the study agreement, the notification requirements, as well as the study deposit. So this is the first section. I'll go ahead and pause and see if there's any questions on the affected system study agreement.
As a reminder to...
As a reminder...
Oh, go ahead,
sorry, please go ahead. As a reminder, to submit a written question, select all panelists from the drop-down menu in the chat panel, enter your question in the message box provided, and send. If you're using the WebEx audio, you may enter the question queue by using the WebEx raise hand icon located just above the chat panel. You'll hear a beep tone when your line is unmuted. At that time, please state your name and question. If you're just on the phone line and not on the WebEx, please dial #2 on your telephone keypad to enter the question queue. You'll hear a notification when your line is unmuted. At that time, please state your name and question. I do see a caller in the queue. Caller, please go ahead. Your line is unmuted.
Yes, this is Susan Schneider from Phoenix Consulting. Can you hear me?
Hi, Susan, yes.
Okay, all right. Yeah, I was wondering, I saw the agreement, haven't had a chance to go through it, but I was wondering if you, how you selected the amount of the $75,000 study deposit.
This is Deb Levine. That's $75,000 deposit. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. The $75,000 deposit was based on the, we've had to do this a couple of times on an ad hoc basis. And so the $75,000 seemed to be what would cover the costs associated with the affected system study that had to be done.
Okay.
And the reliability piece and no deliverability associated with it. So it kind of happens to be half of what someone would pay in order to get into the phase 1 and phase 2 studies.
Okay, well, that's what I was wondering, is because phase 1 and phase 2, there's 2 studies that you have to pay for, but here you're only looking at 1 study, right? There's only
Correct.
just 1 study here, right, usually?
Yes, just 1 study.
Okay, but because it's sort of an ad hoc and one-off, it's usually somewhere around 75,000.
Correct.
Okay, all right, thank you.
Sure. And I'd just like to note, for those of you who like to do it, we have posted a Word copy of the agreement. So if you want to submit red lines, we're happy to accept them as part of the comments on the 31st.
I do not see any further questions in the queue as of now.
All right, sounds good. Let's keep moving then. So on the topic of retirement and repowers, the CAISO is proposing to include interconnection service in addition to or consistent with the retention of deliverability following a retirement and repower. So backing up and giving some overview, once a project announces retirement, they have a few options to repower the project and come online to retain their deliverability. And ultimately now we're proposing to retain their interconnection service as well. And so those processes are either enter the Q cluster study process or submit an independent study process request prior to the 3-year retention mark, or be studied for repower and be actively engaged in construction at the 3-year mark of that retention period. And so, again, similar to deliverability retention following retirement, the projects also have interconnection service rights, and the CAISO doesn't currently explicitly define what those interconnection rights retention is, and here we're clarifying that the interconnection customer will retain the interconnection rights concurrent with the deliverability rights, and that is for that 3-year period. I'm going to keep going with the retirement and repower section, and then we'll pause after a couple slides for questions on all 3 topics. So the repower study plan timeline, the current tariff requirement is that the CAISO is to tender a draft study plan within 10 days of receipt of a repower request. And given that the validation of that interconnection request oftentimes takes longer than 10 days, and the data that's required for that draft study plan is pulled from that valid interconnection request, the CAISO is proposing to remove that 10 business day requirement to tender a draft study plan and allow the validation process and then subsequently the draft study plan tendering following the validation. All right, and then the last retirement repower topic is the CAISO currently doesn't explicitly define what repower or we don't have specific language in Section 25 that defines the repower process. And so currently the Section 25 tariff applies to a number of different projects, including those that are seeking to connect to the CAISO grid, proposing modifications to their existing generation units, generating units that are seeking to repower the units that retain deliverability, and also generating units that currently are identified as qualifying facilities and converting to a CAISO participating generator. So really the purpose of this is to remove ambiguity around modifications or to modify the repower specific language as proposed in the paper. Would make a final note here that there's really no policy changes here. We're just clarifying the language that's in Section 25. All right, I'll pause here for any retirement and repower questions.
I do see a couple of callers in the queue. Moving on to the first caller. Caller, please go ahead. Your line is unmuted.
Is that me, Mark Roost?
Yes.
Are you talking to me? Are you talking to me?
Yes, please go ahead.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, Mark.
When you're doing a lot of, okay, so there's going to be, I'm with a battery and solar energy startup, and when we are doing a lot of changes, and when we're basically systematically going through the system and replacing existing fossil fuel generators of any kind with solar and batteries, for example, rather than having, in environmental impact report analysis, there is a thing where you look at the cumulative impact, and then individual things are carried under that cumulative impact. So something parallel to that would be very economically helpful in systematically changing the grid to all renewable energy and battery electric storage. And so could you come up with a way of saying, if we're going to change this section or all of them, then these are the considerations, these are the detailed things that need to be done, rather than reinventing the wheel each time?
Mark, I don't quite understand what your question is.
My question is, okay, my question is whether there could be some semi-automation, what are the commonalities? Let's remove those from needing to, other than a checkbox, let's remove studying everything that's, that we can, it's like do one study, do one shot or a few shots for basically different situations, and assume that you're going to be changing everything that is fossil fueled, but at least by 2045, but I would say by 2030. And rather than bogging down the organization and causing a lot of costs to be incurred by the people who are doing the changes, what about doing a general blanket? So, okay, there's another metaphor: a blanket purchase order and releases. Only there would still be information needed for each release. That's the kind of concept I'm trying to get across here, and request that you consider the possibility of doing that. Because
Okay.
I can predict very clearly, strong prediction, you're going to have to change everything out. So you might as well come up with a system for doing it efficiently.
So, Mark, what we've done this year, unlike previous years, is that we've split the interconnection process enhancement, which is going to start later in September, which is where your question should be brought up.
Thank you.
And we pulled out all of the items that we need to change in the agreements. And this initiative is only dealing with the items that we need to change with respect to the agreements, so that we can get those done quicker instead of waiting for the longer term IPE process that will start in September.
So it sounds like you're already doing it then.
Yeah.
Yeah, you already anticipated what I'm thinking.
Yep.
Thank you.
No problem. Thank you.
Moving on to the next caller. Caller, please go ahead. Your line is unmuted.
Hey, folks, it's Mark Smith. I think I've answered my own question, but so the process for retirement is that we seek retirement from the ISO. The ISO does a study. The ISO confirms that a unit can or cannot retire. I think what you're suggesting, and maybe you can just clarify, I think what you're suggesting is that deliverability and interconnection rights are retained for 3 years after the approved retirement date. When you say units get 3 years after quote unquote retirement, units may sit for quite some time before they're actually dismantled or disabled or whatever the case might be. Is my understanding there correct, that you have 3 years after the approved retirement date?
That's my understanding. Deb, do you have the same?
Yeah, I agree. That's the intent.
Okay.
Agree.
If we can just make that incredibly clear in the BPM and the tariff, that'd be great. Thank you.
All right, we'll take that note, Mark. Thank you.
Moving on to the next caller. Caller, please go ahead. Your line is unmuted.
Yes. Hi, Susan Schneider, Phoenix Consulting. Is this? We can all hear when the announcer says your line is unmuted, so it's not clear who she's talking to. I'm sorry. So is this me now?
It is you, Susan. Go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Actually, I had the same question as Mark, but I had thought that because there's a lot of discussion, it's really unclear in the proposal about whether you're talking about when the application for repowering is submitted, or the retirement, or I had actually thought it was when the time that the generator had last generated, that it was 3 years from that time, because you could wait until the unit stops generating and then. And maybe, I don't know if you're submitting, you may have a must-offer obligation. If you're not an RA unit, you wouldn't even have that. And then later submit a repower application, and then there's some other things that happen. So I was just wondering, I actually had thought it was the last time, it was 3 years from the last time the unit had generated. So I guess if you're going to clarify that next time, that would be extremely helpful for retirement or repowering.
Yeah. Susan, there is some clarification in the BPMs that define that, and we'll go back and we'll take this note, we'll go back and review that language and ensure that we're incorporating the appropriate terminology and timing relative to either 1 generation or 2, the approved retirement date.
That would be great for retirement or repowering. And then it also, the idea of being actively engaged in construction, it would be good to have a little bit of clarification on what that means as well. And then I have one more question. So on slide
Okay.
9.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, on slide 9, there's one right before this. This idea of the study plan, first of all, the 10 business days is laughable, at least the few that I have participated in. So this is anecdotal. I've never seen anything come back in 10 business days. It certainly seems reasonable to make the benchmark for that when the request is validated, rather than when the request is submitted or accepted, or I've forgotten what the exact language is. So that actually does make sense. And in fact, I have seen this process seems so cumbersome, where sometimes it takes 3 months or more to get a study plan. Then you have to do the study, and then if the study concludes and the project can be repowered, then you have another 3 months or another study that has to be done for facilities. And so maybe the combination of those two things is more of an IPE question, but I guess I would be really uncomfortable taking out. I agree, resetting the benchmark for this 10 business days is probably a good idea, because if it takes you time to validate it, but maybe just set a validation timeline and then a study plan timeline, because it just seems like there's no way it ever takes 10 business days. But it still seems important to have some kind of pressure to say, well, there is actually some kind of target at least, so that you're not just waiting for 3-4 months and go, well, what's going on? Do I have a study plan? I don't have one. What am I doing here? And there just seems like they're just removing the 10 days and then having no other changes here does not really offer any. This is very minimal protection as it is, because I don't think it's normally adhered to, but having no targets whatsoever, I think would just be really an uncomfortable position, and no notice requirements, nothing about any requirement of timing here, I think would just be really a step in the wrong direction.
Okay. Yeah, Susan, your comments well noted. I would say if you could include that in your written comments, that would be appreciated, and then we'll evaluate.
Yep, certainly we'll do that
in the next turn.
Okay, thanks very much.
Great, thank you.
I do not see any further questions in the queue.
All right. So continuing on to the modification section, the first topic is aligning COD with power purchase agreement. So currently, when a project seeks a TPD allocation, there are 7 groups that a project can fall into. One of those groups is Group 3, which allows a project to seek an allocation by claiming they are proceeding without a power purchase agreement. When projects seek under Group 3, they are encountered with certain criteria, limitations, and requirements. And one of those limitations is that they may not extend the commercial operation date beyond the date originally proposed in their interconnection request. I guess kind of sidebarring, the projects, on the commercial side are not prohibited from continuing to seek a power purchase agreement. And there are times where projects have received an allocation in Group 3 and subsequently executed a PPA with a purchasing party. And so we currently don't allow those COD extensions, and we're proposing to allow those Group 3 projects in the event that they do acquire a PPA to extend the COD of the interconnection request to match that power purchase agreement. All right, and the next modification topic is allowing projects to convert to 100% storage. This one's pretty straightforward, I think, but currently there is a tariff, or the tariff prohibits a project from completely converting to a battery storage project. We've had a number of projects in the recent past reduce their non-battery portion of their projects to 1 megawatt, and then come back and ask if they can remove that 1 megawatt. And unfortunately, our answer has been no. We would like to change that and allow projects to convert to 100% storage, either through a material modification or a repower study request. All right. And I'll go ahead and continue with the modifications for Appendix U as well. So Section 4.4 of Appendix U provides rules for current serial projects to request modifications prior to achieving their COD. With the evolution of this overall study process, Section 4.4.4 is now no longer consistent with 4.4.6. So kind of just real simply, the CAISO is proposing to align the serial process to be consistent with our existing modification procedures, and by doing so, we're proposing to delete Section 4.4.4 of Appendix U. And then the other Appendix U modification being proposed. So additionally, Appendix U was predicated on previous study processes such as the feasibility, system impact, and facility study. These studies and restudies are now performed in the cluster process under the phase 1, phase 2, and then the annual reassessment processes as well. So again, the CAISO is proposing to delete Section 6.4 and 7.6 of Appendix U and rely on Section 8.5 of Appendix U, as well as the language and policy and procedure in Appendix DD going forward. All right, and I'll pause there on the 4 modification slides.
As a reminder, if you're using the WebEx audio, you may enter the question queue by using the WebEx raise hand icon located just above the chat panel. You will hear a beep tone when your line is unmuted. At that time, please state your name and question. I do see a couple of callers in the queue. Moving on to the first caller. Caller, please go ahead. Your line is unmuted.
Yeah, hi, it's Susan Schneider again. Would you mind going back to slide 11, please? First of all, I had actually thought that this was already the CAISO practice. Is that not the case?
Deb, I'm not familiar with any that have requested to extend their COD with their PPA, but it may have happened in the past. So I'll rely on Deb here to provide any insight.
Yeah, so what ends up happening is that we don't have the authority at the moment to allow a Group 3 project to go beyond their COD, even if they have an executed PPA that has a date later than their current COD. So that's why we want to fix this.
Okay, because it seems like oh, sorry, go ahead. I didn't mean to interrupt.
And it's happened once.
Okay, because it seems like what you'd be in having it not be your current practice, you would have made the decision that the definition of Group 3 that doesn't allow extending the COD, that takes priority over the other part of the tariff that does allow extension to align with the PPA. So you would have sort of decided that one takes priority over the other, and so how does that work?
In essence, what legal has told us is that the Group 3 requirements take precedent over the alignment of projects with executed PPAs.
And why would that be? There are just 2 provisions in the tariff.
It's how the dominance of the provisions are set up in the tariff.
Okay, all right, and it seems like under the proposal, you're proposing you want to allow people to do this alignment, not only if it's beyond the maximum time of queue, but if it's less than that, right? So I mean, it seems like okay, all right, so yeah, so you weren't intending to. Okay, that's all the questions, the clarification questions I had then. Thanks. Oh, I'm sorry, one more question. It's on the Appendix U on slide 14, if we could go to that. Okay. If you're going to be deleting those 2 sections, then it seems like wouldn't you then still need some kind of reference to phase 1, phase 2, or some kind of reference to the GitApp in that process?
What ends up happening is that the section 6.4 and 7.6 are both restudies for the feasibility and the system impact study. So we'll go ahead it'll just default to the Appendix DD.
Okay, but does it automatically default to Appendix DD, or you're going to put something in there that does that?
The current thought process is it automatically defaults to DD. But obviously legal will go ahead and confirm that.
Yeah, it would be good to just clarify that. So.
Okay.
Okay. Thanks. That's all I got for this one.
Moving on to the next caller. Caller, please go ahead. Your line is unmuted.
Yes, thank you. Mark Roost with Sustainable Energy, Inc. And I just want to strongly support allowing projects to convert to 100% storage. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mark.
I do not see any further callers in the queue.
All right, sounds good. We will continue on to the interconnection study process agreement. So here, the interconnection study process agreement that is part of the interconnection request in the Q cluster study process is effective upon the, I do air quotes here, submission to the California ISO. Following the process that was established a few years back, the Q cluster application window projects must submit a complete package to be included in the study process. And if that complete package is deemed incomplete, the project or interconnection request is not studied nor charged for any interconnection or study costs. They would ultimately be refunded 100% of their study deposits, and until the package is deemed complete, the study agreement is really not necessary and doesn't need to become effective. So rather than being effective upon the submission date, we're proposing to change the effective date to be the date in which that interconnection request package is deemed complete, which then means it moves into the validation and hopefully ultimately the study process. I'll pause here for any questions. All right, hearing none, let's go ahead and continue on to the market quality, our final topic. So Clyde Luton is here with me as well, or with us as well, to provide some technical background. I'll go over the first slide and then hand it off to Clyde. So with the integration of higher renewable or variable energy resources, or VERS, and the increased amount of rooftop solar, the CAISO is experiencing over time an increased level of variability on the system. Currently, we have no real-time forecasting or real-time visibility to rooftop solar, and yet we still have to maintain, or the CAISO still has to maintain NERC requirements to balance that supply against demand on every 4 seconds. And so, kind of just getting down to the nuts and bolts, CAISO is proposing to change the governor-like droop settings in Appendix H of the LGIA and Attachment 7 of the SGIA, where we're planning to change that plant level from 5% down to 4%. And Clyde, do you want to take over the next couple slides and just give us some of the background and technical information to support this proposed change?
Thanks, Jason. So for those of you not really familiar with droop and bandwidth, it's really two terminologies that the industry uses today. And droop basically means, how fast do we need resources to respond to frequency deviation? And bandwidth simply means, when do we need those resources to respond to frequency deviations, right? So I just wanted to point out in this slide 17, the current challenges that we've seen on the grid currently. So most of you are familiar with the 3-hour ramps. And within that 3-hour ramps, we started to see the 1-hour ramp really, really huge. Last year, based on 1 minute data, the net load ramp in 1 hour, the highest that we saw was about 7,500 megawatts. And that's a lot of movement to move in 1 hour. Right. So 7,500 megawatts, just to put that in perspective, is about 3 times SMUD peak load that we try to move in 1 hour. So the analysis we did back in January, looking at the 3-hour ramp, that's going to be over 20,000 megawatts by 2022, 2023 timeframe. So that's a lot of movement. Today, what we've seen in 10 minutes is the natural variability is greater than plus or minus 1,000 to 1,500 megawatts in some hours. And that's a lot to deal with. So the reason why, we have we propose in the group and bandwidth settings is when you have this kind of movement in 10 minutes, it causes a lot of concerns, right? So basically what we say here is the challenge the ISO is facing today is not an N-1 problem or an N-2 problem, but it's an N-0 problem. So under normal steady state conditions, dealing with the natural variability that we're seeing is so big. And what's causing that is, we got, when you think about 14,000 megawatts of grid connected solar, now we got another 12,000 megawatts of rooftop PV. Under the rooftop PV, we have no visibility, no controllability. You cannot really sustain that output. And then 6,000 megawatts of wind. Right off the bat there, you can see that's about over 30,000 megawatts of renewables. And on a weekend, the load could drop to about 18,000 megawatts. So you can see what's really happening, right? We really need renewables to play a role in providing key grid or essential grid services, like things like voltage control, frequency control, ramping capability. Now the frequency control or the bandwidth that we're proposing here is not really to address frequency response, but is really to address frequency deviation that we see normally on the system, right? So two things I can say we can look at. One, the two is the wind test that the ISO, the demonstration test that we looked at and published a report in 2020. We did the same thing with solar plants. We published our report in 2017. And in those tests, on the fly, we were able to send changes to the plant controller to change bandwidth and group settings basically on the fly. So we were able to do that pretty quick, pretty easy, rerun the test. And this was based on actual response that we saw from a 300 megawatt solar plant and a 130 megawatt wind plant. So the response that we saw based on the group and bandwidth settings were not simulation, it was actual response. And what else? Let me see. Can you move on to slide 18, please? So on slide 18, so I think Jason already talked about what we're planning on doing, changing that group setting from 5% to 4% and cutting the deadband in half. One more slide, and then I can pause for any questions you may have. Slide 19. So on slide 19, well, actually, two more slides. Slide 19, the WCC has a guideline right now on group settings and bandwidth. On the group settings, WEC requirement is we can set group settings anywhere from 3% to 5%. And the 5%, they wanted to retain that for hydro units. 4%, the recommendation is for combined cycle plants. And so hence, the 4%, what we're thinking, we can get a lot of support from renewables. And on the measurement is we need to have some kind of evidence that where the group and bandwidth settings are in real time. And slide 20, I think that's my last slide. And on slide 20, we showed, this is just a summary of the Western interconnection, all generating units. The maximum deadband settings is supposed to be like 36 millihertz. But when you look at places like ERCOT already cut their bandwidth settings to in half, basically 17 millihertz, where they have all generating units except steam, the hydro turbines. I spoke to ERCOT just recently. They do not see any negative impact, but they see, the system performing pretty well. We did have conversations with WEC on changing the bandwidth settings. WEC does not have any concerns, nor do they have any concerns with the group settings. With that, I'll pause there to see if there are any questions and take it from there.
I do see one question in the chat, so I'll read that out loud. It's from PG&E. The question is, how would the change in GISPA effective date impact distribution projects seeking deliverability through the CAISO cluster studies?
Isabella. Oh, go ahead, Debbie.
I already answered that question in the chat.
Okay.
Oh.
It was about the GIPSA.
Okay, thanks, Debbie.
Okay, I see a few questions in the verbal queue. Moving on to the first caller. Caller, please go ahead. Your line is unmuted.
Yeah, hi, Susan Schneider, Phoenix Consulting. This seems like a very different item than the other items in this package here, which are mostly just minor, contract and process adjustments. This seems like a very serious technical issue that possibly is going to need more airing than what this more truncated process might allow. So I just want to sort of offer that as an observation. Also, I guess I have two questions that are specifically about this. One of them are the grid-connected projects having to adhere to more stringent agreements because of the lack of control over the rooftop solar projects?
Not really. They go hand in hand, Susan. So as you know, the primary responsibility that we being the ISO, and I would take this strictly from a reliability standpoint, is to support the interconnection frequency, right? So this is something I focus on quite a bit. So when you have, and let me just go on the DER side for a moment. When you have so much DER that you have no controllability on, we tend to control the grid on a weekend with 25% of the supply, for which we have no visibility. Second thing is the grid connected solar. This is what we have visibility on, what we can see, and grid connected wind. That variability now is getting to be so big, it's causing control problems, right? So one of the reasons why I think this was included here, it was interconnection, change or proposal.
Right. No, I understand. Almost anything you do would affect something, say, in the GIA or the tariff. But this is a more serious and detailed thing than, when does the GISPA apply? I mean, it's definitely not in the same category. I don't think of the other things here. But my question was, are you having to, it seems like you're having to control the whole system through control provided by grid connected resources because you can't control the rooftop solar type resources. Is that a true statement?
That is correct, but to be fair to the distribution, I know PUC under Rule 21 have made some positive changes, things like when we have high frequency or high voltage on the system, they require rooftop PV, the new ones, to back off and try to help us control the grid. But anything or anywhere you have generation on the system, in any interconnection, it impacts system frequency, right? So the only thing we have controls of is the grid connected stuff, really.
Okay, so you would agree with that? I mean, I'm just trying to understand it. Okay, all right. So let me ask a couple of other questions then. Would this apply to resources only since you're putting it in the GIA? Would this apply? It creates a little strange, kind of a strange situation. So if it's in the GIA and you've got resources that have already signed the GIA, and then often what happens when you come in for a modification and then you have to revise the GIA, the CAISO has this practice of going and having to sign whatever the current, making changes to go to and sign the current pro forma. So my question is this change, would this change apply to resources executing a new GIA going forward? Or is there any kind of retroactive application that could happen to a resource either in general, or if it just makes a totally unrelated modification to its project?
So Susan, I'm going to defer this to Debbie. She's more familiar with the contract side than I am.
Yeah, so Susan, the ISO would treat it the same way. If you're coming in for inverter changes or technical changes on your project, we would incorporate the updated Appendix H and Attachment 7, just like we do today. If
Okay,
you're
but
coming
there's...
in for a
I'm sorry, go ahead.
If you're coming in for a COD change, then we don't update those sections.
Okay, because I actually have had several changes recently where the frequency response changes that were made the last time were incorporated in the GIA, and then there had to be some other thing in the appendices possibly to exempt what was already operating. There is already in Appendix H, I think, a language that says this only applies going forward, basically. And it would be helpful if you're going to be making these changes to make it clear that this does not apply to modifications that don't have anything to do with this, and to modifications, to basically to existing projects that are already operating. So that's, I think, really unclear in the whole modification process, and would be, if you could take that language that's in Appendix H or something similar to that, and apply, and also do it to apply it or include it in provisions like these new things that come in later. That would be helpful, because it just seems like a one-off struggle every single time going through trying to revise the GIA.
Okay, thanks.
Moving on to the next caller. Caller, please go ahead. Your line is unmuted.
I'm assuming that's me. This is Dario Shomamali on behalf of California Wind Energy Association. So what I'm understanding here, first of all, you're relying on utility scale renewables to help with slow variation in load following during the morning ramp and the evening ramp. Am I understanding this correctly?
It's broader than that. It's looking at all hours, basically from sunrise, before sunrise to after sunset. And then some odd hours we also see, trying to also with the natural variability.
Okay, and I can understand that they can help you with morning ramp or when the ramp.
We lost your connection. Let's move on to the next caller, and we can come back to Dariush when he reconnects.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Jeff, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. This is Jason.
And I can hear you.
Yeah, so Dariush, if you could go closer to your phone, I think we might be able to hear a little better.
Oh, I see. Okay. So is this better now?
Yes, it is.
Okay. So from what I understand, so I'm assuming that this is what's intended here, and it is intended that utility scale renewables would help the system ahead of all the other resources, which is whatever it is. By reducing the deadband, you're doing that. Of course, I see that you have changed the droop, which is helpful. Now the question is, but they only can help you when the issue is ramp up, not with ramp down. I'm assuming you have done some simulations and see the results of these things. As Susan said, this is a serious change, not only on our side, on the renewable development developers and operators side, but also on system side. and I think we need to go through some serious discussions around it. Especially, I'm not a big fan of reducing the deadband, which sort of gets these resources to start providing frequency response earlier than all the other resources. But I was wondering, you realize that the renewables can only help when the ramp is on the way up, ramp is going up too fast, correct?
So not really, Darish. During the middle of the day today, if you notice, we tend to see oversupply conditions. We tend to see negative prices. We have a challenge meeting downward dispatchability. So in other words, we got to commit resources. Like, let's say you have to commit a combined cycle plant. You got to operate a unit above Pmin to get downward dispatchability. So the plus side here is making this change is going to reduce the curtailment of renewables. That's one. And two, we know to integrate more and more renewables. Renewables got to play an important role, right? So I see a lot of positive in terms of renewables helping, because on any given day, you tend to see so much curtailment, especially on weekends during the summer months, right? So you're going to get help on both sides, upward movement, downward movement. Again, this is not for frequency response post-continuity. This is for normal, steady state frequency.
So this will apply to storage units as well, right?
Correct.
Okay, so I think maybe for those issues with fast ramp down, that's where you rely on storage mainly. Obviously, renewables, unless they curtail the output, cannot provide you with frequency response, steady state frequency response, but storage units can. I'd like to ask that we go through maybe a more systematic process for this particular change of discussion, stakeholder process, so that the industry has time to review and properly react, as Susan mentioned as well.
Okay, so in lieu of the requirements, the work requirements between 3 and 5%, and what we've seen other interconnections do with the ones that have a lot of renewables. On the test that the ISO already completed, you still want to see a more formal process to implement changes.
At the minimum, we would like to see the results of your studies, so that you did mention that you have done some studies and it showed that this change will be very helpful. At the minimum, I think the industry deserves to see the result of those studies to see
right.
that.
And those, the results here directly were published in the ISO's wind demonstration test and the solar demonstration test. We can send the link to those after this call, and you can clearly see we did that step by step, where we changed the bandwidth for actual frequency events in the West and actual AGC control signals from the ISO. So you can see actual response from inverter-based resources as opposed to a simulation that was done based on generic data type, that folks use to do studies.
Okay. Well, let's start with that, and hopefully all is cool. I'm assuming you've been working with inverter manufacturers regarding this change in bandwidth. That's the one that sort of concerns me, which basically gets renewables to get involved a lot more often in helping with maintaining system frequency, and more often than other resources. Obviously, they would get involved first, and then then other resources will get involved. It's just, again, not the end of the world. It's just maybe a little bit more deliberation would be helpful. But starting with reviewing those studies is going to be a very helpful step.
Right. Okay. Yeah.
Thank you.
Moving on to the next caller. Caller, please go ahead. Your line is unmuted.
Hello, Mark Roost with Sustainable Energy Inc. Looking at slide 16, how about aggregating and balancing deliveries to the grid, fairly distributing the revenue opportunities, and prioritizing grid needs as a way to monetize surpluses to on-site and microgrids and create harmony? So what I'm getting at there is the idea of working with aggregators to make it to instead of having no visibility or very limited visibility of the solar inputs as they fluctuate over time and geography, work with aggregators who will deal with that, and then then they'll work with you to meet your needs, and then they would distribute the revenue opportunities among their aggregatees, so that was fairly done, and it would prioritize grid needs, and then that would monetize. It would support grid needs, and it would enable the suppliers, the solar suppliers, for instance, to monetize the surpluses of after their on-site and microgrid needs. I'm looking forward to the fully networked grid and create some harmony there. That's
right.
Beg your pardon?
So, yeah, so that's a good question, right? So when you say the aggregate, I presume you mean the DER aggregators, right?
Yeah.
So,
yeah, that's what I'm talking about. Those folks.
Right. So remember, we already got over 12,000 megawatts of DER sitting there without the capability that we're looking for, right? When I say capability, without the ability to ramp, without the ability to accept a dispatch signal from the ISO and respond to that in the time frame that we need response. Now, we do have a slew of other proposals that, to deal with this variability that we're seeing. We, as I said, PUC, I like what they're doing. We also had input trying to get some more capabilities embedded in the new rooftop PV that's coming in. And for instance, like the ability to ramp, et cetera. But that's going to take a while, right? So we got to live with what we got today. So when you think about 12,000 megawatts existing without that capability, a DER aggregator is not really going to help much. Right?
Well, what I'm thinking of, okay, the context in which I'm saying that is the expectation that we will put storage everywhere, that the existing solar will get retrofitted with storage, that new solar, because the storage is going to cost well under $100 a kilowatt hour to build it, and it's going to sell initially probably at $120 a kilowatt hour, then down to $100 a kilowatt hour, and then as the market goes down, it'll reduce too. So the stationary will be going down along with the traction batteries for vehicles, where there's more price competition. And so that means that the market will open up for, and if you put incentive structures in, if you make it so that it's really attractive economically for people to participate with an aggregator and thereby support the grid, and because with the kind of storage management that Tesla provides in Australia, for example, it's on the millisecond. So the battery can soak up when you need it to. The sun, it can contribute when you need it to. So it's basically going through the battery as a gatekeeper, and that can give you enormous flexibility. And so if you if you basically set it up so that it's going to create a market for the aggregators, to expand their business. So you're basically balancing capital and public interest, but coming up with a synergistic response. So that's what I'm trying to get to there. And then on page 17, where you say oversupply conditions continue to increase, enough stationary and mobile traction batteries can time shift any oversupply to a point at which oversupply becomes resilience buffer or is used for direct CO2 drawdown and subsidy for low-income people. So what I'm looking at there is the idea that there is never too much storage or solar on the grid, as long as there's enough storage to sop up any surplus solar or wind. That we will have, the economics are going to change as we completely saturate the grid with renewable energy and batteries and get rid of the fossil fuels. There will be this situation where we're providing enough to deal with week-long storms and things like that. So that constitutes a surplus when it's not needed. It's a resilience factor when it is needed, and what we can do with the extra surplus, rather than making it uneconomic, we can sell that surplus into a new market, which is for drawing down carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, with support for farmers doing that in the soil, but also with direct carbon dioxide removal and direct methane removal from the atmosphere, which takes electricity to handle. So we'll have a large market for that, which could be a third of total global usage at some point. That's just what we have to do to compensate for the fossil fuel created climate chaos that we have now.
So Mark, those are good points. And we started thinking along those lines also. The challenge that we face today is, and you have a good point with utilizing the speed with, the storage has, right? But remember, when we balance the grid, you cannot have something that could move extremely fast and everything else could move really slow. So in other words, we got to deal with units that could move between 2 and 20 megawatts a minute. We do have very few hydro plants that can move faster than that. So you cannot really have a storage plant or a wind plant or a solar plant that could move super fast, and you're trying to do this balancing only because we get benchmarked, and we got some folks in this call aware of this. We get benchmarked by NERC as to how well we control the grid or support the interconnection frequency every minute. So it's not across 5 minutes or across an hour, but every minute they look to see how well we balance supply and demand. And we
you can do that on a second. You can do that on the second basis, using batteries with the kind of control software that Tesla is using in Australia.
Right, but I'm getting to that. So the second thing too is we do have a proposal where we're going to allow the speed, but in the AGC timeframe, not really in the market timeframe. So there are a few things we're looking at, because you've got to do this balance between, supply and demand, looking at the policies and the standards we need to comply with in real time. And I think it's not really a fair comparison to say Europe is doing this, Australia is doing this, because nowhere else in the world you have the strict control performance standards as we have in the U.S. In the United States, every balancing authority, they have 4 real-time control performance standards they got to comply with. And if we fail one of those, they come with up to $1 million in fines per event. They do not have this in places like Australia. They do not have this in places like in Europe. They allow frequency to swing, and they can control. They can allow overgeneration. They can allow inadvertent to go to neighboring PAs. We cannot do that in the U.S. We got to contain it. So we're trying to do this in a smart way. It's going to take some time. Ultimately, we see storage being the light at the end of the tunnel, but we got to, step before, walk before we can run on this one.
Yeah, I understand. I'm talking actually 2 years plus out into the future. Our battery will probably hit the market in September of next year if things go well for us. And then we can add factories quickly, so it can explode essentially, not explosions of battery explosions, but exploding the amount of storage on the market. And it sounds like we need to basically escalate the discussion to the federal level and get like president, administration, as well as FERC, starting to look at how this is going to come together in the next they're thinking 15 years, I'm thinking 2 years. So in the next 2 to 10 years, how are we going to pull all this together and make it work?
Mark, this is Deb Levine. If you could go ahead and just put all your comments into the reply comments that are due on the 31st. We need to take additional commenters who are waiting in line. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Moving on to the next caller. Caller, please go ahead. Your line is unmuted.
Hey, Clyde, it's Mark Smith. How are you? I have a very narrow question. The current tariff states that droop settings for combustion turbines are 4% and all other technologies are 5%. So is this a change at all, or is this really what the tariff already demands?
The tariff already demands that. It says, we can do anything within that 3 and 5. So it's just recommended this change what's existing.
Clyde, hold on. So, Mark, this change is only for asynchronous machines, not for combustion turbines. So Appendix 8.
No, Deb, I'm with you.
Okay.
I'll send you the tariff that I'm speaking to, but here's what it says. Participating generators shall set governor droops for each generating unit with governor controls no higher than 4% for combustion turbines and 5% for other technology types. I figure asynchronous machines are other technology types. So I don't know what change you're recommending here. It sounds like it's already required by the tariff or allowed by the tariff. I'll put that in comments, and I'll give you the tariff section that I'm referring to. Sounds like it just needs to be coordinated.
Thanks, Mark.
Yeah. In essence, what we're trying to do is move the asynchronous machines that are currently at 5% down to where the combustion turbines are at 4%.
Okay, I get it. So you're trying to move them down to where combustion turbines are. Oh, okay, I got it. All right, thank you.
I do not see any further callers in the queue.
Okay, so Jason, I think it's back.
This is Jason. I was going to say, this is Jason. I think that wraps up all the topics. Isabella, do you want to take over and close this out?
Isabella, I think you're on mute. Can you please unmute yourself?
Sorry about that. I was double muted. Yes, so for next steps, as mentioned earlier today, the comments are due on August 31st, which is 2 weeks from today. And you can submit comments using the ISO's commenting tool through the template that's provided on the initiative webpage. So that initiative webpage is linked here. The template has been published, so it is available to you now through August 31st. And then for any additional questions, you can contact Jason Foster, and his email is also on this slide. So I'll just stop to see if we have any last questions before we conclude. Okay, not hearing any. That will wrap up today's stakeholder call. Thank you all for your participation, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.